The Unitary Development Plan, which is the current policy framework, requires WHO guidance, that's World Health Organisation guidelines, to be met in residential development. These are 35 dBAQ in indoors during the day, 30 during the night. As a consequence of these guidelines, it is very difficult to provide residential in some locations. I think there's a thing on the wall. Sorry?
What does to provide residential mean?
It's difficult to have residential land uses in some locations because the external noise is so high that it's very difficult to provide an environment, particularly if people want to open their windows. So,
what does the word?
Yeah, provide residential or floor space in some locations. Are there some locations in the city where this requirement should be applied more flexibly? And if so, how can we ensure development incorporates adequate protection against noise?
Are you saying should we allow residential in a noisy environment?
I think that's the first principle. And are there any circumstances where we should allow residential? Do you think we should ever allow residential where we can't achieve these guidelines, or are there any ways in which we can achieve them even in very noisy environments? Yes, certainly.
It's Brian Woodham from the St James Conservation Trust. We have been making a case about noise pollution for about 5 years in St James. And what I'm about to say is probably totally controversial. We are, in fact, guided by a very well-known acoustics expert. But the World Health Organization standards for, and it says for health and good living, sets a standard. And it appears from the advice that is being followed at the moment that it is illogical. And what I mean by this, I think it's 10 decibels below or 5. I forgot what the local, the most recent instruction is. But with the increase of noise in London, as there was with smog, as there was with the plague, this is a curse in London. The noise is going up. What it needs in London is a mechanism for ratcheting it down. And a very good standard is the World Health Organization standard. To say that it will be X decibels below that is illogical, because as the noise goes up, as you put in new air conditioning equipment, for example, the standard will not be acceptable. You'll never ratchet back this curse on London. That's all I want to say, but it's very radical.
Thank you.
Matthew Bennett, Soho. I think this question really demonstrates that, as on a number of issues, that not all parts of the city are the same in terms of residential amenity. And certainly there is high demand for people to come and live in Soho Covent Garden area. And by and large, there appears to be a recognition that you're not necessarily going to be living in a very quiet environment, and that although the WHO levels are desirable, in fact, I think there's some discrepancy between the figures that you quote and those that are in the actual draft noise strategy, which are slightly higher levels. But anyway, but if asked sort of trade-off between having some element of noise and having to live in accommodation which is completely air-conditioned with windows which cannot be opened at any time of the day, and to live in an air-conditioned environment with its cost, with its sustainability problems and so on, it is pretty clear, anecdotally in talking to people, that they're prepared to put up with some level of what might be called noise pollution in order to be able to live in these central areas. There was a recent case in Shaftesbury Avenue where a developer was proposing to provide some flats, and the only way they could meet those conditions was by having them totally closed and air-conditioned, and it was pretty clear that that's not what residents wanted. So I think that the idea that it should be a desirable standard, but there may well be circumstances in which some flexibility at the margin would be a sensible way forward.
Okay, thank you.
I think there are quite a few party animals who like living in the sort of Covent Garden atmosphere. There's no doubt about it, and I know a couple of them. I would put emphasis the other way round, Lisa, which is in the noise strategy that you're developing, I see this concept of labelling places tranquil areas. I think that's a potentially very, very important concept and a breakthrough for Westminster. And I would like to see that developed so that what Westminster does, along with its conservation areas, if you like, you start to put those two things together, where you have a sensitive townscape and hourly you have a tranquil area, so that a very clear message goes out to commercial development. Actually, we have to protect the aural quality of that amenity as well. That's the bit that's missing. So looking at your tranquil areas idea, which you might be able to say more about now, I think is very interesting, and I'd like to see that develop and a lot more information on it.
Perhaps my colleagues could just...
Shall I just give an outline? The origin of that, I think, is with the European Noise Directive, which actually focuses on open spaces in terms of tranquil areas. Yep. And that's an exercise the government is going through at the moment. And our thinking has been primarily around that, right, about there being quieter places that people enjoy, open spaces in Westminster.
Respite spaces.
Yes, and the risk is that noise would rise in those areas, and one wants to find ways to avoid that. It hasn't been seen at this stage as protecting residential areas that are particularly tranquil, but that's an interesting approach.
Well, here's a suggestion. Extend it to that. Push that concept out, particularly in connection with conservation areas.
Okay, thank you. Councillor.
I guess I'm very glad there is this thinking going on about noise. I'm not quite sure if I've understood the gentleman from St James's correctly, but I would advocate trying to figure out what the noise is actually all about, where it's from and why it's rising, as part of the exercise that goes on. And I also want to assist somebody who's on one of the planning subcommittees raise the question of air conditioning, which itself causes noise, and to plead, and I'm always concerned when we're told that proposals meet the requirements in relation to noise, because as somebody who hears the underlying hum, which has been attributed to people having sensitive ears as opposed to things making the underlying hum, I do wonder whether, in fact, these requirements are rigorous enough. Because having an underlying hum going on all night from a source that you can't actually identify, or if you do identify, do anything about, is very wearing for people. And I think that all needs to be borne in mind when this policy is being developed.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask on air conditioning, because this is so important. I know that limits are set under the planning condition, which is fine. But the problem with air conditioning is it deteriorates over time. That's the problem. And I don't know if the council has any kind of renewal scheme, whether people who've been granted planning for air conditioning then have to go back 5 years later and there has to be another trek, or whether it's a totally reactive process and that nothing is done until a complaint is made. Because it's about maintenance a lot of the time. And whether we can improve the maintenance regime for some buildings to make them go through certain checks every